Hello everyone, and welcome back. In today's video, I'm going to talk about my favorite ways to get a yield on ETH. Now, several months ago, I did a video on this as well that I will link in the top right. A lot of that video still holds true today, but I think there are very different places to get a yield on ETH now that are also very profitable. Now, I'm going to limit my search to basically single staking options or options where you're only getting exposure to ETH, so you're not taking on exposure to other assets with your principal. Now, before we get into that, I do want to briefly talk about why I think it doesn't really make sense to borrow against your ETH and farm with that stablecoin that you borrowed. Now, this isn't to say that stablecoin yield farming can't be a great option. It's more to say that if you have a bunch of ETH and you don't want to sell it, I don't really think the best way to get a yield there is to borrow stablecoins against it. I think it's to get a yield on the raw ETH itself. So why is that? Well, let's go through a very quick example here. So let's just start with the assumption that you have $100 of ETH. Now, if you're on a Compound or an Aave, a blue chip protocol, you're not really going to get paid to lend out your ETH as collateral there. Let's say you're getting under a 0.5% APY, so pretty negligible. In addition, let's also assume that you want a pretty healthy collateral ratio, so you're only willing to borrow 40% against that. And I actually think this is kind of high, so this really isn't too conservative of a number at all. What that means is you can only borrow $40 against your $100 of ETH. Now, to borrow against that ETH, you do have to pay a fee on platforms like Compound and Aave. So let's just say that borrow cost is a 3% APY. Now, you can get around that borrow fee on a platform called Liquidity, but let's just stick with this example for now because I don't think it makes a huge difference. So with all of that said, let's assume you can get a 30% APY on stablecoins, which I would argue is on the higher side of what's standard right now. It's definitely achievable without getting too risky, but you're definitely going to have to get creative with where you find a yield. So with all of this taken into account, your true yield only comes out to be about a 9% return on this initial $100 of ETH. Now, if you didn't have that borrow cost of 3%, let's just say you got a 12% yield on your ETH, but all in all, it's really not that impressive for going through all of this work and taking on the risk of getting liquidated. So I would argue that if you can get within a reasonable range of this 9% yield, you're probably better off just getting a yield on ETH itself without lending it on a platform and borrowing against it. So now that we've covered that, I want to go over 5 ways to get a yield on ETH. So the first platform I want to cover where you're going to find a ton of different yield opportunities for different assets is Convex. Now, I covered Convex on my channel when it first came out, and since then, it's really become a staple of DeFi with over $16 billion of TVL. What Convex essentially does is it boosts the yield you get on Curve, so if you find a Curve pool you like, chances are the yield is going to be a bit higher on Convex. I would say at this point Convex is very reputable, there's a ton of TVL in it, so you're probably safe, but of course you want to do your own research there. If we go to the Stake tab, we can scroll down to what I would consider the best ETH yield on this platform right now, and that is this ALCX pool, which you can see is getting about 12% right now and projected to be about 8.5% next week. So what this pool is it's a Curve ETH ALCX ETH pool. Now, ALCX is ALCX's synthetic ETH token. I have a video on that if you want to go over the risks and how that protocol works, but I would say this is on the fairly safe side. Obviously, you're taking on risk of a few different platforms here, but you're getting compensated with about a 12% yield. Now, these rewards aren't auto-compounded for you, so something to keep in mind is that depending on how frequently you want to compound, let's say every month is good, you're going to have to incur gas fees there. Now, this option I would say is pretty solid, but if you're okay with the ALCX token, you do have another option, and that's going to Saddle's website and looking at their ALCX pool here. So Saddle is very similar to Curve, but their token isn't trading yet, but they do have one. So what's really interesting here is this ALCX pool, you can see ALCX is incentivizing it with a 10% APR, and you do have to stake that on ALCX's website, just keep in mind. But you're also getting a Saddle token reward that's not factored into the APR or the APY because it just doesn't have a price yet. But if you're comfortable estimating a price for the Saddle token, you can actually estimate your APR that you're getting from the ALCX tokens and the Saddle token. So if you think the Saddle network will be worth $1 billion or that the token price will be $1, I calculated that this APR from the Saddle tokens, the SDL tokens, comes out to about another 10 to 11%. Now, this Saddle token has a vesting schedule attached to it, so something to keep in mind there. So obviously you have to kind of discount that APR a bit, but still, you might be getting, I would say at least a 20% APR here. if Saddle launched their token and allowed trading for it right now, I would actually expect a valuation higher than 1 billion fully diluted, just because the market's so hot right now. So something to keep in mind, this is a pretty compelling option. If you're interested in reading up on the Saddle token, I will link their official Medium post below. So next up is Tokemak, and I have a full video dedicated to Tokemak on my channel, which I will link in the top right. Tokemak essentially splits out liquidity pairs into two sides, and you can see here that they're incentivizing users to deposit ETH to get ETH liquidity, and they're paying out 7% APR with the Toke token. Now, of course, this isn't the highest yield on ETH, but a few things to keep in mind. One, you're only taking on smart contract risk from one platform, whereas with the ALCX token and the ALCX yield farms, you're taking on risk from a few different platforms. In addition to that, I would just say never put all of your eggs in one basket. So if this yield is somewhat compelling for you, maybe you want to consider diversifying your ETH positions and just putting a bit here. Next up, we have Element Finance, which is a personal favorite of mine. I have a full video dedicated to this as well, and I interviewed one of their team members. So if you want to check that out, I will link that in the top right. But Element essentially allows users to get a fixed yield on different assets. So if we look at the fixed rate page here, we'll just scroll down to ETH because that's what we're interested in. And I'll click that there, and you can see it's giving us what I would consider is a pretty low APR for ETH, but there's a couple things you have to keep in mind here. So the first is this fixed APR does not include the return you get from Curve itself, which would be the swap fees and the rebasing of the staked ETH token, which gets about 5.5%, and you get half of that on Curve. So all in all, you're getting about a 7% APR using Element here. So I would argue a 7% APR is great. Obviously, 3.86% of that is fixed and guaranteed, and the other 3% or so that I calculated from Curve is variable, but I would say that's fairly consistent. So expect about a 7% yield here. Now, one important thing to note here is Element does not yet have a token, and as you all know, I recommend that everyone tries out every different protocol they can that doesn't yet have a token, because it's possible you could receive an airdrop. Now, obviously, I don't have any inside info here, but again, just try every platform out. Everyone will have a token. Now, lastly, I wanted to cover StakeWise, which I think many of you probably haven't heard of yet. StakeWise is an alternative to Lido Staked ETH and Rocket Pool's rETH. They essentially have their own staking mechanism, and they're incentivizing it pretty heavily right now. So if we hit start staking here, I can show you what some of the yields look like. We'll just go to the farms tab. And you can see they're incentivizing liquidity providers to provide liquidity for these ETH pools pretty well. So this pool on the left here is the pool I'm most interested in. It's an ETH, and then their sETH2 pool. The sETH2 token is just their yield ETH token, their staked token. And you can see if you provide liquidity there on Uniswap v3, you're getting about a 16.6 APR. Now, this pool on the bottom left is what I'm most interested in. It's a Uniswap v3 pool for ETH and then sETH2, which is their staked ETH token. And you can see the total APR there is about 16.6%, and you can see the breakdown of where the APR comes from. So that does include the ETH2 staking rewards. I would say this option is probably going to be the most gas intensive and complex because you have to create a Uniswap v3 LP position. So just keep that in mind, that you're probably going to want to have a larger position if you want to stake here. So that is pretty much everything I wanted to cover. I think based on these assumptions that I showed you at the start, obviously you can adjust the math depending on if you think you can get a higher or lower yield on stablecoins, or if you want to borrow more or less against your ETH. But I would say that you can probably just get a better yield on just ETH itself. Now, of course, if you hold stablecoins and you want to continue holding them, then sure, get a yield on them. But in my estimation, I think it's probably just easier and makes more sense just to get a yield on your ETH without borrowing against it. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe. I do plan to come out with a new updated top 10 yields for stablecoins video, because I think now we're seeing 30% APYs is pretty common, which is exciting. So definitely stay tuned for that. Now, I want to thank you all so much for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I look forward to seeing you all in the next one.